Chapter 9. Tarhoon's eyes flew open to the sound of frantic knocking. He sat up in bed, trying to determine the origin of the sound. It wasn't his door, it seemed farther down. Tarhoon realized it must be the main door to the fortress itself. He rose and went to his door, belting his sword to his waist as he did so. As he opened it, he saw Fee open hers as well, 2 doors down. "Does anyone hear that?" she called down the hall.
"Yes, and I'm trying to sleep."
Shirk's voice came loudly through his closed door. Tarhoon walked down the hall past Fee and headed for the front. "Good luck! Yell if you need help," Fee called after him, before closing her door again.
"Or don't. Just sleep, that would be good too."
Shirk's voice echoed down the hall. Tarhoon smirked. He went down the stairs and made it to the front door. He opened it, feeling the cool breeze blow across his chest. In the doorway stood an elf. The elf's copper skin and brown hair told Tarhoon this was likely a wood elf. His blue eyes implied he had a human ancestor somewhere up the line, but his strong elven features showed it had mostly been bred out of him. He wore leather armor across his chest and bore leather bracers. His hair was a tangled mess with leaves and twigs strewn throughout. He also carried a tall staff. From the overall look, Tarhoon surmised this elf was a druid. "What business do you have at this watchtower?" Tarhoon asked, with brows furrowed. "I just heard that you are looking for the king of the forest, and I am looking for him too." The elf spoke with a smooth French accent. Tarhoon said, eyeing the elf. He heard soft footfalls coming from behind him. "Who is it, Tarhoon?" Fee called.
"It is an elf druid," Tarhoon informed her. "He appears to be searching for the king of the forest, as we are."
"Interesting," Fee said, coming up beside Tarhoon. "Where do you come from?"
"The forest," the elf replied enigmatically. "I am an elf of the wood."
He motioned to the forest behind him with his arm. "Right, well, nice to meet you," Fee said. "You can sleep here if you want." Fee was looking at the newcomer curiously. Tarhoon wasn't sure he liked the idea of inviting a stranger into the fortress so brazenly, but the offer had been made. Tarhoon refused to be rude enough to turn away someone already invited in. He made his way back through the castle until he located where Sally was in order to inform her about their unintended guest. He eventually stumbled onto a room with a door that was covered by a bear pelt, which he took to be Sally's room. He knocked briskly on it. "Hello? Who's there?" He heard Sally's distinct accent issue from the other side of the door.
"There's an elf here that seeks sanctuary," Tarhoon said. "He appears to be looking for the king of the forest."
"Oh, okay. Cool. Did you get his name?" Sally called back. Tarhoon thought for a moment, then cursed his lack of foresight. He let silence hang in the air before speaking.
"I did not," he said,
just loudly enough to be heard. Sally replied that she didn't care as long as the door was locked behind him. Tarhoon walked back to their sleeping quarters to find Fee setting the newcomer up with a room. Shirk was just walking in as well.
"Who's the tree hugger?"
Shirk asked sleepily. "I am Valendor. I'm looking for the king of the forest," the elf said curtly.
"Oh, great. He'll be here tomorrow. I'm Shirk, by the way."
Shirk shook Valendor's hand. "Nice to meet you," Valendor replied.
"Good to see you as well. Tarhoon, don't kill him, please,"
Shirk requested, drawing a glare from Tarhoon and a very confused look from Valendor. Shirk cleared his throat and opened his palm.
I have some things here for everybody.
In his hand were small devices that Tarhun couldn't discern the use of. Each had a small knob on it, with a hook that extended out.
It's 10 gold apiece, but these will let you talk to anyone in the party for the low price of 10 gold. We can always talk to each other, no matter what, since we kinda lost our person who can psychically communicate. Ahem.
You make money on them? Valendor asked.
No, you just pay me now and I give them to you, Shirk responded.
Tarhun was suspicious.
That's it.
Where did you get those from? Fee looked at the devices curiously.
I have a very good source, Tarhun replied proudly. Upstairs, he added less proudly after a moment.
Right, Fee said suspiciously. How much did you pay for those, Shirk? Fee demanded, putting her foot down sharply.
I just gave Hendrik some potato vodka. You guys can just have them, honestly,
Shirk admitted sheepishly. Tarhun, Valendor, and Fee all took one, reasoning they could give one to Elwood later. Shirk showed them how to stick it in their ears and loop it around the lobe.
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
Shirk asked, and Tarhun heard the bugbear's voice in his mind. He wasn't sure he was comfortable being able to hear Shirk at any time, but these would prove useful. The elves were amazed.
He didn't really have a name for them, so call them whatever you want,
Shirk told them. Tarhun blinked slowly.
I wanted to call them earring talkies.
Tarhun blinked slowly again.
You guys could come up with a better name. I'm going back to sleep,
Shirk told them, exiting the room. Tarhun followed him and returned to his bed. Tarhun was awakened again to the sound of something strange on the other side of his door. He sleepily arose from his bed and felt something was amiss. He felt the same pressure that he had in his mind that night at the mine. His eyes snapped open. "People, we have a guest!" he heard El shout suddenly from 2 doors down. Tarhun heard multiple sets of claws clatter down the stone outside, one of which stopped right in front of his door. Tarhun gripped his shield, unsheathed his sword, and flung the door open. Outside, a large, furless, hound-like creature snarled at him. Its back rose almost to the height of Tarhun's chest, and its long, open mouth dripped saliva onto the rock in front of him. Its paws sported huge black claws, coated in blood. The creature had a thin membrane that stretched between part of its jawbone and skull, giving it a skeletal look. The part of its snout that extended past this sported razor-tipped teeth that extended forward from its upper and lower jaws. It had sunken eyes that looked out from its sockets with hunger. Spikes protruded from the back of its head, and it had a sloped back like a gorilla, although much more lithe. Its shoulder blades rose from that back in huge mounds, and its nose was 2 holes that extended from its sloped foresnout back into its head. Tarhun furrowed his brow in determination, strategies brewing in his head. Clearly, there were other enemies in the hallway, so the wisest thing to do would be to fight the enemy conservatively in the doorframe to keep them from swarming him. He couldn't expect the others to do the same, but at the very least he hoped the 2 on the end could use the hallway's width to keep them from doing so. The monster was currently staring at Tarhun viciously, but it wasn't attacking. Tarhun waited for it to make the first move. "Do you people need me to read you a bedtime story?" Elwood was shouting. "Fine then, I'll read you this book. I was born many moons ago on the planed grasslands of Antioch, he began reading. Tarhoon sighed as he knew that Elwood had fallen into one of his mentally deficient spells again. Shirk, save him! Tarhoon shouted, hoping the bugbear was in a better position.
You save him, Shirk yelled back. I'm the farthest away from him. Why is he What are those?
Tarhoon figured Shirk had just discovered the threat in the hallway. I have made a grave error, Elwood shouted back, confirming Tarhoon's suspicions. Tarhoon frowned at the sound of a bear's roar echoing through the hallway.
Hey, it's a bear!
Shirk shouted from down the hall, before his yell turned to fear.
Oh no! It's a bear!
The creature in front of Tarhoon was momentarily distracted by something in the hall, and Tarhoon rushed past it into the hallway. He took in the situation. 2 others of these monsters were in that hallway, one at the end in front of Fee's room, and one at the next door to the right of Tarhoon. The one to the right, however, was being assaulted by a gigantic bear that had somehow made its way into the castle. Shirk stood just outside his own room on the far side, gawping at the bear. He had no monster in front of him, but what he had shouted was true. He was the furthest away from El. Tarhoon had no time to think about this now, because the door to El's room was blocked by a gigantic, 10-foot-tall humanoid creature. It wore no clothes, but also had little distinctive characteristics over its body. The most unique thing about it was its head, which was triangular in shape, although Tarhoon couldn't see it well from this angle. Tarhoon charged the creature and swung his sword as hard as he could. Moments before Tarhoon reached it, the creature snapped its triangular head in Tarhoon's direction. The pressure in Tarhoon's mind became stronger. This daunted him, but he had no time to think about it, because in his attempt to save Elwood, he was now upon his enemy. Tarhoon's blade slammed into its side, and a loud screech echoed in Tarhoon's head. He winced. A hissing sound issued from the hole in the creature's face. As Tarhoon's sword hit, he began to think this creature must be the leader, as it was unique among the quadrupeds. His suspicions were confirmed as he heard a growl behind him, and the monster on the other side of the tall one snapped its head from the bear in front of Valandor's room to glare at Tarhoon with menacing eyes. "Excuse me, I'm trying to read," Elwood yelled from inside his room. Tarhoon had a brief thought that he may have made a mistake before the 4-legged creatures on the other side of the tall one ran around it and tackled Tarhoon to the ground. The breath evacuated Tarhoon's lungs as his back hit the solid stone, and his enemy's jaws spread wide over Tarhoon's snout. Blood dripped from the monster's haunch from a bite the bear had taken out of it as it had rushed Tarhoon. The other 2 hounds had left their prey and moved to assault Tarhoon as well. Fortunately, Tarhoon's shield had been caught between his own body and the one that had tackled him, so as it tried to slice into his flesh, it met nothing but solid wood under its claws. Tarhoon saw another gaping maw appear over him, and lurched his head to the side just quickly enough to hear the loud snap of teeth right next to his ear. He heard the sound of a bear in his head, but was too distracted to figure out why.
"The bear ate what's his name?"
Shirk called from behind Tarhoon. Tarhoon was entirely sure this wasn't the time to be worrying about Valandor, but as long as his head remained fully attached to his body, he wasn't going to argue. The 3rd hound, the one that had tried to bite Tarhoon's face, jerked violently to the side as Shirk's blade plowed into it at full strength. Tarhoon noticed that this did remarkably little damage, but the strength behind it fully diverted the hound's attention. Tarhoon vowed he would remember Shirk saving his life, and vowed he would repay the debt.
"What are you doing?"
Shirk shouted at Elwood, who was still reading. Tarhoon closed his eyes in pain as it radiated through his head. It felt as though a club was bashing itself onto the inside of Tarhoon's mind and he growled in pain. The pressure blocked out the chaos of noise and movement that was going on around him, and for a moment, that pain was all he could feel. The pressure faded to a dull thudding, and the cacophony of noise flooded back into Tarhoon's senses. Tarhoon couldn't see much of what was going on, as one of the hounds was still upon him, but he got a glimpse of Elwood now in the fray, reading a book and swinging as wildly and inaccurately as attempting to fight while reading would imply. The hound on top of Tarhoon pulled its head back to jerk it forward and bite Tarhoon, but before it could do so, the hound jerked violently sideways into the wall, and the bear now stood over it. Tarhoon rose from the ground before he could be pinned again.
"Focus on the leader!"
he shouted to the others, before charging the humanoid enemy again, who had distanced himself from the fight to the other side of the hall. Tarhoon gripped the holy symbol around his neck and cast a spell of protection upon himself. He dropped the symbol back to his chest and swung his sword downward into the man in front of him. The monster deftly sidestepped his blade.
"Tarhoon, get out of there!"
Tarhoon heard Shirk shout from behind him, but Tarhoon barely heard this. Tarhoon's single-minded focus was on the leader, and the leader alone. He thanked Bahamut that his protection spell was working, as no attacks came toward his back. Tarhoon grasped his holy symbol again and said another prayer. This prayer was also answered, and his sword suddenly illuminated the entire hallway as though it was broad daylight. He swung his sword again, but the creature quickly dropped out of the way.
"You look mangy, and you suck!"
Shirk cried out.
"And you—"
Shirk began, but seemed to be coming up with an insult.
"Well done failing to kill the person right in front of you," Tarhoon suggested loudly over the din.
"I'm helping you," Shirk responded angrily, not understanding.
"No, that was an example,"
Tarhoon yelled in exasperation.
"Yeah, what he said. You suck at fighting, and you keep running away,"
Shirk yelled over Tarhoon's shoulder. Apparently, this fulfilled some technicality in whatever spell Shirk had just tried to cast, because the creature in front of Tarhoon moved to the side and began to back away from him rapidly.
"Someone kill it!" Shirk shouted.
Tarhoon turned to run after it, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw Elwood attempt to light whatever book he was carrying on fire using a torch. This failed, however, and as the flame of the torch disappeared, it suddenly reappeared as he withdrew it, leaving the book unharmed. Elwood's cloak, however, was now on fire. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Elwood shouted ineffectively. He ripped his cloak off with his free hand, still not looking away from the book. Tarhoon figured that someone else could help him with that. He was determined to kill the leader.
"Why are you on fire? What are you doing?"
Shirk cried. "I tried to burn the book," Elwood responded. Tarhoon rushed past the bear, who gripped one of the remaining hounds by the neck and ragdolled it back and forth. Tarhoon caught up to this humanoid enemy and cut a wide scar into its chest. He prepared to strike again, but the back of an arrow suddenly sprouted from the creature's head. It shuddered for a moment, before a long wind blew from the hole in its face, and it keeled over. Tarhoon turned around and saw the remaining two hounds stop dead in their tracks. He held his breath, hoping this meant surrender. Then a low screech emitted from their jaws. They turned and began to assault all around them furiously, all sense of coordination gone. One of them tried to bite at Elwood but missed. Its claw struck true, however, peeling strips of flesh from Elwood's shoulder. The other assaulted Shirk, biting Shirk in the leg, and then sighed in quick succession. Shirk drew a knife from his belt and plunged it into the flesh of the hound in front of him. Elwood threw the torch into the hound in front of him, burning its back a bit. Having realized the torch had done little, Elwood decided to put his still-burning cloak to good use. He leapt sideways onto the animal and rolled off it, landing on the floor. Tarhoon's heart sank. He saw the bear moving for the one in front of Elwood, so he dashed forward to aid Shirk, who still had a hound's jaws clamped onto his side. The throbbing pain in Tarhoon's head flared again and blocked out all sensory input. Tarhoon's sword fell from his hand and he dropped to the floor. He heard vague sounds of combat around him and was aware of another body hitting the ground nearby. A blurry paw slammed down in front of Tarhoon's vague and pained vision. Hazy voices made their way into his ear, but were muffled by the pain. As it receded, Tarhoon was aware of the clawed foot in front of him. He reached beside himself for his sword, found the handle and slashed forward with all his strength, cutting deep to the bone. The creature lifted its leg in pain, almost falling over. An arrow from Fee, who had risen from the floor, pierced its neck and put it out of its misery. Blood spattered across the floor from the wound, and it fell. Shirk laughed at the corpse before launching his dagger at the other hound.
"Elwood, tear out the dagger and hit him with it. It's better," Shirk yelled after it.
"Die!" Elwood shouted in response as he attacked. Tarhoon took this opportunity to push himself off the floor and stand again. The pain in his head was now a dull throbbing again. He turned to the last remaining hound and slashed desperately at it with his sword. The sword barely cut into it and then bounced off. It was at this moment Tarhoon discovered that the hounds had extremely tough hide, and therefore his sword was of little use. Before he could use this knowledge for anything, Fee, who had been on the other side of the last hound and the bear, scrambled up over the bear and tried to slash at it with her hand axes. She fell off the bear, though, and landed in a crouched position with axes at the ready. The hound tried to snap and claw at her, but she backed off quickly enough to avoid it.
"You're gonna die real soon," Shirk yelled at the hound. "My friend the bear over here is gonna kill you."
Elwood took another wild swipe, and the bear took a large chunk out of its side. The beast tottered to one side briefly before falling onto the floor. Taking a moment to catch their breath, the party stood, breathing heavily. In time, Tarhoon walked up to Elwood, examining the book in front of him. "Please do not look at the pages. It will ruin your life," Elwood said in a panic. "Do not attempt to set it on fire, or it will set me on fire." Tarhoon attempted to pull the book from Elwood's fingers, but it wouldn't budge. On closer inspection, Tarhoon determined that it was stuck to Elwood's fingers. Tarhoon attempted to close the book with all his strength, but that also proved fruitless. At least now Tarhoon knew why Elwood had been foolishly reading throughout the entire fight. "Anyone else want to try?" Tarhoon asked. The throbbing in his head was dull now, but he still felt weak.
"I have an idea,"
Shirk replied. "Have you considered touching it with your sword, Tarhoon?" Elwood suggested. "Do you remember what happened when you tried to use the torch on the book?" Tarhoon said dryly. "It went through and lit your cloak on fire. If we try to stab the book, it will probably go through the book and stab you in the back." Tarhoon attempted to cast a spell to command Elwood to sleep. Elwood collapsed to the ground, and one of his eyes snapped shut. Half of his mouth drooped as though it was asleep, and his right arm dropped. His legs buckled. The other eye, however, if anything, was more awake than before. The arm on that side was sticking out, bent partly, and holding the book in perfect reading condition. Shirk ran forward and shoved Tarhoon out of the way.
"Everyone get out of the way. I'm going to cast a spell," he said loudly.
Fee and the bear ran down the hall, and Tarhoon weakly stumbled after them. He turned and looked just in time to see the exact same phenomenon happen. This time, the moment Elwood regained control of his faculties, he gripped his head in pain. "Both of you stop! Just let me read. I need help, not this." Shirk finally gave up and led Elwood back into his room. Tarhoon turned around and saw that, in the place of the bear, Valandor the elf stood. "That's one mystery solved, at least," Tarhoon thought. Valandor walked over to the humanoid and inspected it. Tarhoon stood up wearily and walked over to the humanoid to inspect it as well. The entire thing was gray skin, modeled into the shape of a human, aside from the claws on its hands and the triangle head. Burned into its chest, however, was a symbol. Tarhoon peered closely at it, and then pulled out the medallion that he'd found on the cannibal. It was the same symbol. That meant it was the same symbol as the medallion the mercenaries had dropped on their way out of town, and the same one they had seen in the wall of the cave. This symbol had been following them throughout this whole venture.
Seeing as these creatures' skin was resistant to being slashed at, Shirk said, approaching, what if we skin them? Try to use their hide?
Tarhoon exhaustedly leaned against the wall and slumped to the floor. Fee had gone to go fetch Yorick, apparently, and Yorick entered with a large gash across his chest, but he seemed to be in relatively stable condition. Tarhoon was too tired to think about anything right now. Yorick suggested they all stay in the amphitheater, keep together for protection. Tarhoon nodded wearily, and Shirk helped him to his feet as they made their way there.